So we will continue Module 1 by examining the levels of structural organization. So there are 6 levels of structural organization within the human body. From smallest to largest, they are the chemical level, the cellular level, the tissue level, the organ level, the organ system level, and finally the organismal level. So in this module, we're going to examine all 6 of these levels of organization. However, within this segment, we'll specifically focus on the chemical level of organization. So the smallest level of structural organization is the chemical level. And within the chemical level, we have elements, like the 4 seen here, which are nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. And those elements can be arranged and connected to one another with chemical bonds in order to form things like molecules. So chemistry gives us the periodic table of the elements. However, many of these elements that are in the table are not found naturally within our bodies. We have very select few and very specific elements that serve very specific roles within the human body. So the 4 elements that are most abundant in our bodies are nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. And combined, they compose approximately 96% of our body weight. These elements are what some of the most important substances in our body are constructed from. So, for example, water is made out of hydrogen and oxygen. Alanine is an amino acid, which is an important component in building proteins. That is, amino acids in general are important components in building proteins. We also have things like glucose, which is an important carbohydrate that is metabolized for energy. So, and although this list of elements here compose only a small percentage of body weight compared to the 4 that we had just described, these elements in this list have very important and critical roles within the body, even though they are minor in comparison to things like nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. We'll start with sodium, and sodium is important in maintaining fluid balance within our cells and within our tissues. It's an important component that allows the nervous system and the muscular systems to generate electrical signals. So we'll see that come into play when we examine the physiology of muscles and the nervous system. Next, we have potassium. Potassium is critical for nervous system and muscle function in much the same way that sodium is. And potassium in particular is very important for cardiac muscle function. Calcium is another important element. It's a mineral that's found within our bones that gives our bones their toughness and their strength. We also have phosphorus, which is an important component of a cellular energy molecule called ATP. And phosphorus is also important in DNA molecules as well. And finally, we have iron, and iron atoms are found primarily in our red blood cells. They are an important part of a protein called hemoglobin, and it's the iron that's in the hemoglobin that's responsible for binding and carrying oxygen in our bloodstream. So we saw a couple of important elements. We'll turn our attention briefly here to the molecules. And molecules, as I mentioned before, are 2 or more elements that are united or joined by a chemical bond. We've already seen a few examples of some important molecules. So I gave an example of water being an important molecule that's made out of hydrogen and oxygen. We also have molecules like carbon dioxide, which is a gas that is produced as a waste product when glucose is broken down and metabolized to make energy. Carbon dioxide is composed of carbon and oxygen. And we have other molecules like glucose, which glucose is an important carbohydrate that the body uses as fuel. And glucose is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So there are 4 important classifications of molecules. We have water, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. And we'll go through a few of these, or we'll go through each of these very briefly now. We'll start with water, and we see that water composes approximately 70% of cell volume, so it makes up a pretty large proportion as far as the volume is concerned inside of our cells. In the body and in our cells, water functions as a solvent, which means that it dissolves chemicals and it also provides a fluid medium for the chemical reactions of life to take place. So when chemicals and molecules dissolve in water, that is, their chemical bonds are going to be broken, which allows the molecules to make new chemical bonds and form new or different molecules as a result of being dissolved within water. So it kind of goes without saying that water is really important, and without water, the chemical reactions that sustain life would not be able to occur, at least as easily as they do in our bodies and in fluid environments. Next we have proteins, and proteins compose approximately 20% of cell mass. Proteins are constructed from subunits that are called amino acids. So if you think of a protein as a brick building, the individual bricks that make up that brick building, at least as far as the protein is concerned, the individual bricks of the proteins are called amino acids. So just like buildings, proteins have a very specific three-dimensional shape that is very important to their proper functioning. And proteins are the same way. Proteins have a very specific three-dimensional shape, and the shape of that protein and the sequence of amino acids that's in that protein is very, very important for both the protein's structure and its function. We see that many of the amino acids that are necessary to build these proteins can be synthesized by our body. However, there are 9 amino acids that we must obtain from our diet. That is, these amino acids cannot be synthesized by our bodies. And we call those the essential amino acids because we need to obtain them from the food that we consume. Proteins have a huge variety of roles within the body. Just to name a few, they function in structural support. Proteins function as enzymes. They function in transport of substances. They function in contraction and movement of the body. And they also function in communication and defense. And so we'll examine all of these real briefly now. So looking at structural proteins, some proteins, their structure resembles a fiber. That is, these are called fibrous proteins, and their structure kind of resembles a rope. These are very rope-like in both their structure and their function because they function in mechanical support. One protein in particular that functions in structure is collagen. Collagen is the single most abundant protein in the human body, and it functions to give support and tensile strength to connective tissues like bones, tendons, and ligaments. The term tensile strength means that this protein is strong under tension, that is, it's strong under pulling forces, and so it functions in pretty much the same way that a rope does. A number of proteins within the body function as enzymes. Enzymes are biological catalysts, and the term catalyst in this, or catalysis in this graphic, implies that these proteins have a catalyst function. What enzymes do is that they increase the rate at which substances are either created or broken down by the body, and so they make it a lot easier for a particular chemical reaction to occur without an additional input of energy into that chemical reaction, energy like heat. And so this means that our body can stay at its usual temperature, about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but at the same time still have enough energy in the system to get molecules to come together and be united, be joined by chemical bonds, or have those chemical bonds be broken. And we see that there's enzymes that will help build and make new chemical bonds, but we also see, for example, like in the digestive system, that there are enzymes that help to break chemical bonds to make large molecules into smaller molecules and help facilitate our bodies to get those molecules from things like the digestive system into the bloodstream, where those raw materials that we've ingested and absorbed into our bloodstream can be used to construct new molecules within our body. So we see that enzymes function to create or break down substances. Some proteins also function in transport. One example of this is hemoglobin. This is a protein that's found in red blood cells, and it functions to carry oxygen. Other proteins that function in transport function as doorways or channels so that substances can move across the membranes, that is the plasma membranes of cells, and then the substances can have a little channel or a doorway to get into or out of the cell. So here's an example of one of those transport channel proteins, and some transport channel proteins essentially act as little water-filled channels or water-filled tunnels that allow small charged substances like sodium or potassium to move across the plasma membrane. So in these types of proteins that function as channels are very quite simply called channel proteins. And these channels tend to be very specific for the substances that they're transporting. So in this example here, this is a channel protein that's specific for sodium, but there's other channel proteins that are specific for things like potassium or calcium. In muscles, we see that certain proteins like actin and myosin function in contraction. That is, they generate a pulling force, and the muscle shortens to generate movement of the body. Some proteins function in communication. So in particular, certain proteins that are called receptors are found on the surface of cells, or these receptors may also be found within the cell, that is, on the interior of the cell. And these receptors are a key aspect in the function of the endocrine system. So with the endocrine system, the endocrine glands will release chemical messengers that are called hormones into the bloodstream. And these hormones will travel through the blood, and they will influence the activity of other body cells and tissues. And the way that they do this is that hormones will bind to very specific receptors on specific cells in very specific organs. And those receptors will set off a series of events within the cell that will change what the cell is doing in response to that hormone binding to its receptor. So we see that proteins can function in communication and have really important communication roles in things like the endocrine system. An extension of that I've got here just kind of showing the extent to which hormones influence cells by way of these receptors. Is I have an example here of what's called a second messenger system. And certain types of hormones, particularly hormones that are amino acid based, will work by binding to receptors on the surface of the cell. Amino acid based hormones generally don't have the ability to cross the plasma membrane and get inside the cell. So the hormones are essentially stuck outside of the cells that they're trying to influence. So what we see is that these cells have receptors on the surface, that is on the plasma membrane, for that particular amino acid based hormone. And so the hormone in this example is what we call a first messenger, and the receptor and the sequence of events that is activated will create what's called a second messenger inside of the cell. So the receptor is typically associated with a protein called a G protein. And once the hormone binds to the receptor, that G protein will become activated, and that activated G protein will then activate an enzyme. And the enzyme will then go on to create another chemical inside the cell that's called the second messenger. And so a lot of amino acid-based hormones work by this second messenger system by binding to their receptors on the outside of the cell. And so it's not the hormone that's directly causing the cellular response, it's the second messenger that's created that's causing the change in the cell's behavior response to that particular hormone binding. So to kind of summarize all of this, even though the amino acid-based hormone cannot enter the cells that they control, that amino acid-based hormone still has the ability to influence what that cell is doing by way of this second messenger system. And finally, to wrap up the discussion on the proteins, we see that some proteins function in defense of the body, particularly the immune system. In this example here, we see these small blue Y-shaped proteins that are called antibodies. And antibodies are proteins that are created by very specific immune system cells that will help by binding to and inactivating harmful things within the body, so that is harmful bacteria, harmful viruses, or toxic substances. So now that we've had a little bit of an overview of proteins, we can examine carbohydrates for a minute. So carbohydrates are the molecules that are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's really where their name comes from. Carbohydrates come in three forms. They come in the form of starches, fibers, and sugars. We see that starches and fibers are essentially chains of sugars that are linked together by chemical bonds. We obtain most carbohydrates from plant-based dietary sources, and really in general all carbohydrates must be obtained from the diet. The majority of carbohydrates that we consume come from plant-based sources. However, there is one animal-based carbohydrate source, and that's lactose, which is a sugar that's found in milk. Carbohydrates primarily function as fuel sources for the body. That is, they are broken down, and the energy that is released upon their breakdown is used to create energy for the body. So, a very few carbohydrates function in cell structure. So most of them are going to be a fuel source. Some of them will function in cell structure and support. And next we have lipids. And lipids are molecules that are composed primarily of hydrogen and carbon. And so the fact that there is very little oxygen in these molecules gives them the property of being unable to be dissolved in water. And this is a property that we call hydrophobic. This term literally translates to water-fearing, but here it implies that lipids are chemically unable to be dissolved by water. We'll examine very briefly three major types of lipids. We have triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. Triglycerides are lipids that are obtained primarily from the diet, and they function as a source of stored fuel for the body, particularly when we're at rest or when we're sleeping. Secondarily, triglycerides will function as a soft padding to protect delicate organs, as well as insulate and protect deep tissues. So adipose tissue is a tissue that contains abundant amounts of triglycerides in it. So adipose tissue does function as a stored energy source because of the triglycerides in it. But we also see adipose tissue functioning as a soft padding around delicate organs, like the eyes on the left diagram here, and the kidneys on the right. So those black arrows pointing to the yellow material around the eyes, that's the adipose tissue that surrounds the eyes. And there's also abundant adipose tissue that surrounds delicate organs like the kidney to help cushion and protect it. So we also see that there is adipose tissue just underneath our skin. As adults, our skeletal muscles are our primary source of body heat. And sitting just above the skeletal muscles is a layer of adipose tissue that's called the hypodermis. And the adipose tissue that makes up really kind of the bulk of the hypodermis helps to insulate the body and reduce heat loss through the skin. So phospholipids are the principal component of cell plasma membranes, and cell membranes are very critical to establishing boundaries between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And this boundary ensures that the cell has an internal environment that it can very carefully control the chemical reactions that keep us alive. So now we'll examine a few other important classes of molecules, beginning with the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA. So as their name might imply, that is, nucleic acids, they are associated with the nucleus of the cell. And generally this is true. So this is true in that DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, is confined within the cell's nucleus. However, RNA, which is short for ribonucleic acid, has the ability to leave the nucleus of the cell and interact with other cell structures. So DNA functions as the source of genetic information for constructing the proteins of the body's cells and tissues. RNA, on the other hand, has a few functions within the cell. One of these major functions is to serve as a messenger between DNA that's located in the nucleus and the structures in the cell that create proteins from the DNA instructions. So you have DNA that's kind of trapped and confined within the nucleus of the cell, and you get this protein-making machinery that's outside of the nucleus but still within the cell. And so RNA essentially serves as kind of the messenger between DNA and the protein-making machinery to make sure that the correct proteins are being made at the appropriate time. So, and finally, let's examine adenosine triphosphate, which is abbreviated ATP. ATP is the chemical energy currency of the body. It's created from the energy that's produced during the metabolism and the breakdown of glucose. And so quite simply, the energy that's harvested from the breakdown of glucose is transferred to ATP, and it's ATP that powers really anything in the body that requires chemical energy.